As with the other reformers who we've already discussed in this class, John Calvin saw himself as a servant of the Word of God. In fact, that was a title that he used to refer to himself. And in much the same way that we saw the power of the Scriptures bursting forth onto the scene of Reformation Europe, and the corruption of the Catholic Church starting to crumble under the light of God's truth, that same thing is true with Calvin. Now, we often think of John Calvin as being kind of one of the three main reformers, and that is certainly correct. When we think of Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin, we would perhaps list them as the three major reformers, and then to their names we could add names like Thomas Cranmer and Martin Bucer and John Knox and other names that we'll talk about a little bit later in this class. But it's important for us to remember that John Calvin really is a second-generation reformer, and that's the point that I'm trying to make. Luther and Zwingli are first-generation reformers. Calvin is a second-generation reformer. He is 26 years, 25 and a half years younger than both Luther and Zwingli. So he really is a generation younger. Now, we tend to think of these men from the pictures or statues or other things that we've seen depicting them. We kind of always picture them as old men. But it's important for us to remember the fact that Calvin, being so much younger than both Luther and Zwingli, saw those other men really as his fathers in the faith. They were the ones who had initiated, by God's providential working through them, had initiated Reformation, and Calvin really was this second-generation reformer. Calvin is perhaps one of the most controversial of the reformers. Certainly, there is some controversy surrounding Martin Luther, especially in the minds of some atheists who want to take certain things out of context and try and blame Luther for them. Zwingli is his own controversial firestorm because of the way that he interacted with the Anabaptists. And yet within Christian circles, and I'm using that term more broadly, but within Protestant Christian circles, I would argue that Calvin's name is probably the more controversial of all three, even though he himself was probably the least controversial figure in his own lifetime in terms of his personality. But you mention Calvin's name in a typical evangelical church in America today, and you might unintentionally split the church just by mentioning his name, because people have such strong opinions of the theological system that is identified with his last name. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into this. So John Calvin was born in 1509. And July 10th, 1509, which means just a few years ago, we celebrated the 500th birthday of John Calvin. There were a number of books that were written and published in 2009 in kind of celebration of that 500th birthday. He's born in France, and he ministers his entire life in the French language, even though most of his ministry takes place just outside the borders of France in Geneva, Switzerland. And Calvin, of course, is forced to flee from France because of the persecution against French Protestants during his lifetime. So born in Noyon, France. Mother died when he was very young. His father was employed by the church. His father wanted John to become a priest, but it was not because of any spiritual aspirations on the part of his father. It was purely financial. And we see those motivations come to the surface a little later on, because his father recognizes that lawyers actually make more money than priests, something that I suppose is still true today. Lawyers generally make more money than pastors. And when his dad figures that out, he encourages his son to become a lawyer. So there's a connection even between Calvin and Luther in the sense that they had strong-willed fathers, both of whom had a very specific vision, financial vision for the future of their sons, both of which involved training in law, and God used that training to his own purposes after he converted both Martin Luther and John Calvin to evangelical truth. He was educated in Paris. He studied Latin and philosophy. He started his university education at the age of 14, which certainly is young, but was not abnormally young for that time period in history. But he finished up even with his master's degree by the time he was 19, so a brilliant young man. As he studied law, he also learned Greek and was introduced to humanism. So again, we see religious humanism having an impact, much like it did on Zwingli's life, now in Calvin's life. And as he learns the original languages of Scripture and is able to interact with the original languages, he comes to be able to read the Bible, and the Scriptures will have an impact on his life. Here are some of the key places in Calvin's life. And so you can see he was born in Noyon. He was educated in Orleans and in Paris. And he then will minister in Geneva after spending a little time in Bern and Basel. And he'll also spend a little bit of time in Strasbourg. In fact, he'll get married in Strasbourg, where Martin Bucer, who is an associate of Martin Luther, one of the other lesser-known reformers, is ministering. Just threw in some graphics here. There's the Great Hall of the University of Orleans, where he attended school at one point in his life. By 1532, Calvin had received his lawyer's license. And in 1533, Calvin started to be involved with some of the Protestant reform movements that were taking place there in France. And God used all of this. Probably wasn't saved yet at that point, but God used all of this to bring him to a saving knowledge of the Savior. Calvin is forced to go into hiding during this time. He eventually flees from France, and he shows up in history a couple years later in Basel. Now he is converted, and he pens his first edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion. Now, the Institutes, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we go through this, the Institutes are written, as I told you last time when we were talking about the Anabaptists, the Institutes are written as a response to the persecution that Protestants are facing in France. Part of that persecution is motivated in the eyes of the government as a response to what they saw at the Munster Rebellion in 1534 and 1535. They are associating the Protestant movement with the political revolutionaries like those of the radical Anabaptists, Jean von Leyden, Jan Mathis, and others. And so the French government is really cracking down on Protestantism. Calvin writes a letter then to the King of France, much like a second century apologist, like a Justin Martyr or one of the other great apologists, addressing the king, saying, hey, look, we are not who you're making us out to be. This is what we actually believe. And in describing what Protestants actually believe, Calvin really produces the first Protestant systematic theology, what we call the Institutes of the Christian Life, or the Institutes of the Christian Religion, or we just call them Calvin's Institutes. It starts as just a 6-chapter work, and it eventually goes through several revisions and additions. By the end of Calvin's life, it's 80 chapters long and about 1,500 pages of material. Certainly in terms of his theological contribution to later Protestantism, it is his magnum opus, the Institutes of Calvin, and together with his commentaries make up the majority of his influential works, though certainly not his only works. This is where Nicholas Kopp, his friend, had begun preaching reform there at the University of Paris, and where they had fled. That picture is hard to see. That's John Calvin as a young man. You can see it a little bit better in your own computer screen. I actually think that if Dr. Snyder grew out his goatee to a little bit more of a point and took off his glasses, that he could pull off a mean Calvin impression. But I'll let you guys be the judge of that. All right, in August of 1536, Calvin sets out for Strasbourg. There is fighting going on right now in that part of the world, and so as a result, he is forced to travel through Geneva in order to avoid French troops. All right, William Farel is the reformer that's in Geneva already. Farel is a fiery preacher of reform. He was in Bern and in Basel and other places in Switzerland. Remember, Switzerland is made up of these city-states, and Farel goes preaching from place to place, and he's actually being used by God to convert Catholic cantons into Protestant cantons, and he stands up in the middle of the street and just starts preaching, denouncing cardinals and priests, and ends up getting in fights and other things along the way because people physically try and stop him, and he refuses to be silenced. So Farel is very much the fiery street preacher of the Swiss Reformation during this time period. Well, he had come down to Geneva, and through his influence, the city of Geneva had determined that they were going to no longer be Catholic, they were going to be Protestant. But Farel recognized that even as a fiery street preacher who, again, wasn't afraid to take on anybody or denounce anybody, very much a 16th century version of John the Baptist, Farel recognized that he was not really equipped to shepherd the church in Geneva long term. He wanted to find somebody who could shepherd the church and disciple the people in a long-term pastoral capacity. As Calvin is making this detour around the fighting to get to Strasbourg, which is a Protestant center under Martin Bucer, he stays the night in Geneva. Farel hears that he's in town. This is after Calvin has published his Institutes. Those Institutes have already started to gain traction among Protestants, giving this young 26-year-old Calvin a great deal of notoriety, and he's essentially a best-selling author at this point. Farel hears that Calvin's in town, and he does whatever he can to convince Calvin to stay. And I note here that Farel's tactics are a bit suspect, but ultimately they work, and we'll read just a little bit about what he did. This is from ChristianHistory.net. With his brother and sister and two friends, John Calvin fled Catholic France and headed to the free city of Strasbourg. It was the summer of 1536. Calvin had recently converted to the evangelical faith and had just published the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which articulated his Protestant views. He was a wanted man. The party, that's Calvin and his brother and sister, put up at an inn in Geneva, and word quickly passed to local church leader William Farel that the author of the Institutes was in town. Farel was ecstatic. He was desperate for help as he strove to organize a newly formed Protestant church in town. He rushed to the inn and pleaded with Calvin, arguing it was God's will he remain in the city. Calvin said he was staying only one night. Besides, he was a scholar, not a pastor. Farel, baffled and frustrated, swore a great oath that God would curse all of Calvin's studies unless he stayed in Geneva. So that's a kind of an interesting way to hire an assistant pastor. I don't recommend that for you in future ministry decisions. You're desperate to get a youth pastor and you threaten some poor young seminary graduate with an oath, a curse from God on all of his future endeavors if he doesn't come and lead your youth group. But that's essentially what Farel does, is he threatens Calvin that if Calvin simply spends the rest of his life in the in the library of Strasbourg, down in a cubicle somewhere, writing books and never interacting with people in pastoral ministry, if he has such a disregard for the work of God there in Geneva that he would leave the church in a lurch, then all of his future studies ought to be cursed. So this is actually one of my favorite pictures in this entire class, because the artist here, I think, has accurately captured Farel's intensity. I mean, you've got this guy who is running around. There's stories about Farel. A priest once tried to physically drag him down, and Farel turned around and punched him in the face. Another priest actually loaded a pistol and shot at Farel and missed, and Farel turned around and said, your shots don't scare me. This is the kind of fiery personality that Farel is. Calvin is this reserved 26-year-old young man who wrote a book that kind of unintentionally became a bestseller, and he just wants to pursue a quiet life of scholarship. He's reserved, he's quiet, he's austere, he's the opposite personality of Luther. He's the opposite personality of Farel. And here we have Farel threatening to put a curse on Calvin. And Calvin, in his own testimony, says he felt the fear of God come upon him in that moment. And suddenly what was supposed to be a one-night stay in Geneva on the way to Strasbourg becomes a lifetime pastoral calling to the church in Geneva. And it's interesting. Calvin is, on the one hand, the most well-known for his commitment to the sovereignty of God in all things, and yet in his own experience he recognizes that God uses human instruments to convince us and direct us in the path. And so Calvin had planned his way, but God was directing his steps, so to speak, and he is using Farel to help him. I love that. I think my favorite expression in all of this is not so much Farel, though, that's priceless, but actually I think it's supposed to be Calvin's sister and brother standing behind Farel, and the look on Calvin's sister's face is just one of shock and horror at the scene that is transpiring before them. I just think it's great. So this is a great, maybe I don't even think this is overly dramatic. It's probably underly dramatic given the story. Calvin does give us, Calvin hardly ever talks about himself. In fact, one of the things that Calvin notes is that early on in his life, before he was saved, that the one thing that he really wanted to achieve was his own fame and glory. And he actually wrote a commentary. I think it was on one of the great Greco-Roman works, and I'm forgetting exactly what the commentary was now. It was a secular work that he wrote this commentary on. And he wrote it because he was hoping to gain great recognition as a scholar for his work on this treatise. And it never really went anywhere. And then when he was converted, Calvin recognized that his whole life was to be lived for the glory of God and not for his own recognition as a scholarly academic. And after God had kind of removed that idol from Calvin's heart, it was then that God gave him the recognition that he was no longer seeking. And in fact, Calvin's own personality, as we've mentioned, he hated being in the spotlight. So he wanted recognition as a scholar, as an unbeliever, but he never wanted to be in the spotlight. And he talks about, even in his testimony, how God seemed to keep dragging him into the spotlight against his own will. So Calvin hardly ever talks about himself in all of his writings, and yet there are a couple places where he does, and one is in the preface to his commentary on the Psalms, where he gives us his testimony. So we're going to read just a little bit of Calvin here, telling us how God brought him to himself. When I was as yet a very little boy, my father had destined me for the study of theology. But afterwards, when he considered that the legal profession commonly raised those who followed it to wealth, in other words, when lawyers make more money than theologians, this prospect induced him suddenly to change his purpose. Thus it came to pass that I was withdrawn from the study of philosophy and was put to the study of law. To this pursuit I endeavored faithfully to apply myself in the obedience to the will of my Father, but God, by the secret guidance of his providence, at length gave a different direction to my course. So I was going to be a lawyer, but God intervened. And first, since I was too obstinately devoted to the superstitions of popery to be easily extricated from so profound an abyss of mire, in other words, I was Catholic, God, by a sudden conversion, subdued and brought my mind to a teachable frame, which was more hardened in such matters than might have been expected from one at my early period of life. Well, that right there is Calvin saying, God regenerated my heart. And so a little less dramatic in terms of its expression than Luther's testimony, but nonetheless, certainly a testimony to the grace of God's initiative in converting a depraved and darkened mind to the truth. Having thus received some taste and knowledge of true godliness, I was immediately inflamed with so intense a desire to make progress therein, that although I did not altogether leave off other studies, I yet pursued them with less ardor. So I was going to be a lawyer, then God saved me, and suddenly I didn't really like law that much anymore, but I loved pursuing the things of God. Being of a disposition somewhat unpolished and bashful, which led me always to love the shade and retirement, in other words, I was kind of shy, I then began to seek some secluded corner where I might be withdrawn from the public view. So I wanted the quiet life of studying and scholarship. But so far from being able to accomplish the object of my desire, all my retreats were like public spectacles. In short, whilst my own great object was to live in seclusion without being known, God so led me about through different turnings and changes that he never permitted me to rest in any place until, in spite of my natural disposition, he brought me forth to public notice. So I was trying to hide out in the library, and God kept putting me in a place where I was in the public sphere. Leaving my native country, France, I in fact retired into Germany. That's a reference really to the entire Holy Roman Empire, which included Switzerland, expressly for the purpose of being able there to enjoy in some obscure corner the repose which I had always desired and which had so long been denied me. And so while I lay hidden at Basel, this is where he actually wrote the Institutes, and known only to a few people, many faithful and holy persons were burnt alive in France. So the persecution in France was getting very, very bad. And the report of these burnings having reached foreign nations, they excited the strongest disapprobation among a great part of the Germans, whose indignation was kindled against the authors of such tyranny. So we were hearing about all the persecution that was going on in France, and it was really starting to provoke us to a righteous anger that true believers would be treated in this way. That's why, he says, this was the consideration which induced me to publish my Institutes of the Christian Religion. So the reason I wrote it was because of the persecution that was going on in France. My objects were, first, to prove that these reports were false and calumnious, scandalous, and thus to vindicate my brethren whose death was precious in the sight of the Lord, and next, that as the same cruelties might very soon after be exercised against many unhappy individuals, foreign nations might be touched with at least some compassion towards them and solicitude about them. So I wrote my Institutes to set the record straight about what these people really believed and who they really were. When it was then published, it was not that copious and labored work which it is now, but only a small treatise containing a summary of the principal truths of the Christian religion. And it was published with no other design than that men might know what was the faith held by those whom I saw basely and wickedly defamed by those flagitious and perfidious flatterers, that my object was not to acquire fame, appeared that immediately after I left Basel, and particularly from the fact that nobody there knew that I was the author. Wherever else I have gone, I have taken care to conceal that I was the author of that performance, and had resolved to continue in the same privacy and obscurity. So he's in Basel, there's persecution in France, he wants to get to Strasbourg, but he has to go through the detour through Geneva, until at length William Farel detained me at Geneva, not so much by counsel and exhortation, so it wasn't that he had good reasons for me to stay, but by a dreadful imprecation, which I felt to be as if God had from heaven laid his mighty hand upon me to arrest me. So when Farel reaches out his hand, Calvin feels the hand of God telling him to stop. As the most direct road to Strasbourg, to which I had then intended to retire, was shut up by the wars, I had resolved to pass quickly through Geneva without staying any longer than a single night in that city. But Farel, who burned with an extraordinary zeal to advance the gospel, immediately strained every nerve to detain me. And after having learned that my heart was set upon devoting myself to private studies, for which I wished to keep myself free from other pursuits, and finding that he gained nothing by entreaties, he proceeded to utter a curse, an imprecation that God would curse my retirement and the tranquility of the studies which I sought, if I should withdraw and refuse to give assistance when the necessity was so urgent. By this imprecation, this curse, I was so stricken with terror that I desisted from the journey which I had undertaken. But sensible of my natural bashfulness and timidity, I would not bring myself under obligation to discharge any particular office. In other words, I agreed to stay, but I wasn't willing to necessarily take on all of the public aspects that Farel wanted me to, at least not initially. So there you go. That was a little bit of a lengthy section, but I really wanted you to hear it all in Calvin's own words from the preface there in his commentary on the Psalms. So he's in Basel, he's hiding from the persecution in France, and he moves around a little bit then and eventually wants to go to Strasbourg. And in his attempts to get to Strasbourg, goes through Geneva, and God has an unexpected stop for Calvin there in Geneva. So Calvin did not want to go to Geneva in terms of long-term ministry, but God had other plans, and he used Farel's unorthodox methods in order to keep Calvin there. So again, not something I would recommend for your future ministry hires at the church that God takes you to eventually, but at least in Calvin's case, it worked. So here is Farel, and Farel would go on to another place, Neuchâtel, and continue the Reformation there. Farel was also involved in bringing the Waldensians into the mainstream of the Reformation, and he and some other Reformed leaders went down into the southern parts of France and met with Waldensian leaders, and as a result of that, we have the full tie-in of the Waldensian movement into the Reformation through Farel's influence. Farel, by the way, is one of the four of those carved statues that you see in the Reformation wall, which is the picture that's on the top of our jewel page. It's John Knox, it's John Calvin, Theodore Beza, William Farel, and John Knox, kind of the four great leaders of Geneva. Of those, Farel is probably the least well-known, but he was the fiery catalyst that God used to even bring Reformation to Geneva in the first place. If it had not been for him, there wouldn't have been a place for Calvin when Calvin went through the city. All right, Geneva at that time was known for its worldliness, wickedness, and debauchery. Certainly it had been a Catholic city, but it was also a very worldly city. And into that context, we have Farel and Calvin now trying to make reforms, not only theological reforms, but certainly moral and ethical reforms as well. And these reforms initially meet with a great deal of opposition from those who live in the city. In fact, there are stories about how people in the city who did not like John Calvin, when they walked by his house, would throw stones and pebbles at his window at all times of the day and night just to bother him and harass him. There were people in the city that would name their dog Calvin so that they could, beat their dog and kick him around and yell at him, and it was all vicariously yelling at the pastor that they didn't like. So these first 2.5 years of ministry for Calvin were not easy, and I'm sure there were many times when he wishes that Farel had not placed some sort of divine curse on him. Obviously, we don't believe that that God actually curses people in that way, but Calvin himself was stricken in his conscience in that moment and felt compelled to stay as a result. They did introduce a strict moral code. This, of course, Calvin did not have any actual authority in terms of being able to pass laws in the city of Geneva. That's an important point that'll become especially relevant a little bit later. But Calvin was tasked with putting together a statement of faith for the city of Geneva. The city council then adopted that statement of faith and enforced that statement of faith. And some of the other moral strictures that Calvin and Farel wanted to have put in place, they were then enforced by the city council. And you can begin to see why unsaved people in a place that had been kind of notoriously corrupt, why they would resist these kinds of reforms. Things like no gambling, no dancing, no singing of immoral songs, and a curfew to keep people home at night rather than running off and participating in these kinds of things. Those reforms, of course, were met with opposition, and eventually opponents are able to gain control of the city council, and it all comes to a head at a communion service when Farel and Calvin are ordered to use unleavened bread in the communion service. I don't think it was so much a matter of whether or not we should use unleavened bread or leavened bread in communion. It was more that Calvin and Farel felt like the city council should not be telling the church what to do. Calvin and Farel refused to allow a number of people in the city to take communion on that Easter Sunday. And as a result, the townspeople essentially revolted against them. There's stories about people in the town showing up at church with, like pitchforks and that kind of stuff, ready to force Farel and Calvin to do this. Of course, they refused, and they were then kicked out of town. So they were given 2 days to leave. And after 2.5 years of being the pastor in Geneva, Calvin and Farel were kicked out. Farel went to Neuchâtel eventually, and Calvin then continued on his trip to Strasbourg. So he's on his way to Strasbourg. He gets delayed. 2.5 years of very tumultuous, difficult ministry in the city of Geneva, and finally he gets kicked out. He gets fired. Calvin is not sad about this in the sense of, I'm sure there were certainly issues that he wished had been resolved, but in many ways Calvin was relieved because he finally gets to go to the place he had been trying to get to all along the way. Yep.
So during this time, would everyone in Geneva sort of be forced to go to church on a Sunday?
Yeah, I think that would probably be safe to say. There is no separation of church and state. So once the city council determines that they're going to become Protestant, and once they all adopt that statement of faith, you either fall in line with it or you face criminal action against you. So you either fall in line with it or you leave or you end up in prison.
So would they all be going to Calvin's church then?
Yes, St. Peter's Cathedral, which was a Catholic church that was converted into a Protestant church, was the main church in the city of Geneva and would have been the main church that people would have attended. Yep.
For people who did not want to accept the decision to embrace the faith that the city council made, were they given an option to leave town, or is it either you come to church or you go to prison?
Yeah, I think once the laws are passed, then it becomes very obvious for people that if they don't leave, they will eventually face criminal charges against them. So the people who really were adamant about not adjusting left of their own accord. So yeah, there would have been, I suppose, opportunity for them to leave. I don't know that it was necessarily you have 60 days to get out or you're going to be punished, but it was more just a natural response to laws that were passed. You have emigration of anyone who doesn't want to, either the emigration or prosecution of anyone who doesn't comply. All right, when Calvin gets to Strasbourg, he actually experiences the best time of his life. So after the really torturous 2.5 years in Geneva, which again, he didn't want to be there in the first place, and it was difficult for him while he was there, it all ended in this great cataclysmic conflict. When he finally gets to leave and gets to Strasbourg, he experiences a huge contrast. He experiences the best time of his life. So these are what Calvin will refer to as his golden years, and he gets to spend now 3 years in the city of Strasbourg under the ministry of Martin Bucer, who was one of the contemporaries of Martin Luther. And because of the persecution that's taking place in France, we have hundreds of French refugees who have come into Switzerland and into parts of Germany. And so there is a French-speaking refugee church in the city of Strasbourg, which is a primarily German city. And so Calvin is put in charge of preaching and teaching to the French refugees who are there in the city of Strasbourg. So he ministers to hundreds of people every week. These are French Protestants who, because they've been persecuted, I think represent a much more genuine and much more gracious spirit, a much more genuine form of Christianity. So this is just a rich, rich oasis in the midst of Calvin's life. While he's there, he has time to write and to preach. He publishes his first commentary, which is on Romans. He also gets married to a widow named Idelette, and both of these events occur in 1540. And here we have some pictures of the old city of Strasbourg. And there's a picture of Martin Bucer. But God, again, has a plan to send Calvin back to Geneva, even though Calvin doesn't want to go back to Geneva. So it's kind of interesting. We associate John Calvin with his ministry in Geneva, and yet Calvin didn't want to go to Geneva in the first place, and he didn't want to go back to Geneva the second time. Now, Geneva is a beautiful city. If you've ever been there or if you've ever seen pictures of it, it's absolutely beautiful in terms of its surroundings. But for Calvin, the hardship that he had experienced there, especially in that first 2.5 years, was such that he really, really did not want to go back. The city council, while Calvin and Farel were gone, the city council in Geneva suddenly realized that, hey, maybe these guys were, maybe they were worth keeping. Maybe we shouldn't have run them out of town. Maybe we shouldn't have fired them. And so they then write to Martin Bucer there in Strasbourg and request Calvin's return. Church attendance had been down, relations with some of the other Protestant cantons were strained, and they really needed a strong and articulate theologian to counter anyone who might want to convince them to go back to Roman Catholicism. And so they thought, hey, this is great. We'll get John Calvin to come back and to be our pastor. Calvin doesn't want to go back. Strasbourg agrees finally in the summer of 1541 to kind of lend John Calvin back to the city of Geneva for a 6-month period. Well, it's going to end up being the rest of Calvin's life. It's not just going to be 6 months. So he goes back to Geneva on sort of a 6-month trial, and eventually he's going to spend his entire life there. And it's not going to be all roses when he gets back to Geneva. He's still going to have periods of extreme struggle with the city council, especially a little bit later when a group known as the Libertines gains control. But here we have Calvin then returning to Geneva. And what's kind of interesting, one of the great stories about Calvin's life is when he got back into his pulpit there in St. Peter's Cathedral, on the next Sunday after he returned, you would have expected for Calvin to get up and say something like, you guys finally came to your senses, or I told you so, or to reprimand or rebuke the people who had been so unfair and unjust in their treatment of him when they had kicked him out. Instead, Calvin said nothing about anything that had happened. He simply opened up his Bible in Romans to the very next verse that he had left off from when he had left. He just opened up to the very next verse and continued preaching verse by verse through the book of Romans as if nothing at all had happened. And so if you had gone to church when he got kicked out and come back 2.5 years, 3 years later when he returned, it would have been as if you'd never missed a Sunday. So now he will spend the rest of his life then in Geneva. And at first things go well. In 1541, the city council approved his ecclesiastical ordinances. This established a church council known as the consistory. The church council was purely a religious body. It had the ecclesiastical authority to excommunicate people from the church, but it had absolutely no legal authority in terms of bringing any sort of civil consequences against those who had been excommunicated. So the consistory is the church council, and it's different than the city council, which has all of the civil authority. During his time in Geneva, he preaches over 2,000 sermons. He preaches almost every single day and is not only preaching but preparing new sermons. And those sermons become the basis for Calvin's commentaries. And the reason that Calvin has a commentary on almost every book of the Bible is because he preached almost every day, and he preached verse by verse through the entirety of the Old and New Testaments, with a few minor exceptions. He did not preach through the book of Revelation, and he did not preach through the last half of the book of Ezekiel, which of course are some of the most premillennial places in all of Scripture. So if you want to have fun with your amillennialist friends, you can reference Calvin's commentary on Revelation or his commentary on Ezekiel 38 and following, and just play with them a little bit, since Calvin commented on everything else except those passages. He reportedly preached for over an hour with no notes, and beginning in 1549, his sermons were recorded by professional stenographers, and that, of course, greatly enhanced the ability to turn those sermon transcripts into commentaries. It's actually a really good model that Calvin establishes here, and I don't know what you men are, what your aspirations are for potentially publishing things in the future, but the model of Calvin is to prepare for a sermon and then to allow those sermon notes and sermon transcripts to become the basis for later commentary publishing. That is the very same model that Dr. MacArthur employs here at Grace Church. He pours everything into the sermon, preaches the sermon is then transcribed, and that transcription is then edited into the chapters that become the commentaries. So it's a great model that allows you to publish things while not being so distracted by publishing projects that you forget to keep the main thing, which is to preach and teach the Word of God. And Calvin, in Protestant church history, is one of the first to employ that model. Spurgeon did essentially the same thing. Spurgeon's sermons were transcribed, they were then edited, and they were published in the local newspaper, and those newspaper articles comprised then dozens of volumes that we know as the Metropolitan Bible pulpit, and also the New Park Street pulpit. But in any case, Calvin maintained relationships with other Protestant leaders and so on, and here we have some pictures of Calvin the scholar, and certainly very, very impressive when we think about the output of these men, Luther, Zwingli, Calvin. These men only live into their 50s, and yet they have such an incredible literary output. I think largely, certainly God had blessed them with special gifts, but I don't think that's the reason. I think the reason is because of their diligence and their commitment to be using their time as wisely as possible in these endeavors. So, just something to think about in your own future ministry, that you would be faithful with the resources and the time and energy that God has given you in producing works that are going to be of benefit to the body of Christ. In terms of Calvin's family life, in 1540, while in Strasbourg, Calvin married Idelette de Bure, a widow who had 2 children from a previous marriage, and Calvin adopted those 2 children as his own. They had a very happy marriage, though it only lasted 9 years, and the reason it only lasted 9 years is because Idelette died in 1549. Together they had 1 son, but he was born prematurely and lived only a few days, so Calvin did not have any surviving successors. Idelette's death in 1549 was a major blow to Calvin, and he deeply felt the pain of her loss. And he wrote shortly after her death, "I am no more than half a man, since God recently took my wife home to himself." Several years later, he would encourage another pastor who had lost his wife with these words, "What a terrible injury, what a pain the death of your wife has caused you, and I speak from my own experience. For even now I fully know how difficult it was 7 years ago now to deal with such grief." So I include some of those little anecdotes in here because I just want to humanize these men. We think of Calvin purely in terms of the books and commentaries that he produced, but he was someone who felt things deeply, even if he didn't express them as openly as Luther did in terms of wearing his emotions on his sleeve. All right, from 1546 then to 1555, we enter a very difficult period in Calvin's ministry. So the first 2.5 years were really, really difficult. And now we have another period of about 10 years that's really, really difficult. And I think this is important for you men to understand, even as you're preparing for pastoral ministry, is when we think about some of the great names in church history, names like John Calvin, or names like Jonathan Edwards, or names like Charles Spurgeon, and we tend to think of them only in terms of the way that they've been appreciated since they've gone home to heaven, the way in which their works have been influential, and the way in which even their ministries were influential in their own lifetimes. We tend to think of all of the good things about them, and we forget about the fact that these were men who experienced times of extreme challenge and opposition in their ministries. And I want to drive that point home. We have with Calvin his 10-year controversy with the Libertines after even the 2.5 years when he had been fired from the church in Geneva. We have with Jonathan Edwards 20 years of faithful ministry after which he's fired by his congregation there in Northampton, Massachusetts. And we have with Charles Spurgeon what is known as the downgrade controversy, where his entire denomination turned against him. It's helpful for you men to remember those things because you also will face times of challenge and opposition in your ministry, and perhaps you think, I'm the only person to have ever faced anything like this. Be encouraged to know that some of the greatest names in church history have gone through far more severe challenges, and while your name will probably never be considered in that same light in a historical sense, you can nonetheless take a great deal of, I think, encouragement from the fact that even the people in John Calvin's church sometimes didn't like him. The people in Jonathan Edwards' church kicked him out and fired him. The people in Charles Spurgeon's denomination wrote really nasty things about him. So when people don't like you, or when your church board threatens you with your job, or when people say or write nasty things about you, you can consider yourself in very good company. All right, by 1546, there was a group in Geneva known as the Libertines, and these were people who just did not like Calvin's strict moral, ethical code, and that's why they're known as those who wanted their liberty. And that's why they're known as the Libertines. They thought Calvin was too harsh and too strict. Again, Calvin's not in charge of the city council. He's not even a citizen of Geneva at this point. So he doesn't even have a vote in the way the city council thinks about things. But he is in charge of the church, and they felt he was too repressive. And so they begin to rebel. 1546, a man named Pierre Ameau criticizes Calvin. To criticize the pastor is to criticize the city council. The city council doesn't like that, so they punish Ameau by forcing him to publicly beg God for forgiveness. But this all only arouses more and more the hatred in the minds of the citizens of Geneva that they begin to have for Calvin himself. Later that year, a man named Ami Perrin, and he's one of the city council members, he was convicted of violating Geneva's no dancing law. Now, to us, this may all sound a little bit silly, but this was a big deal at this point in church history. Perrin would become the primary leader then of the Libertines and Calvin's main opponent. So he never really forgives Calvin for this stricture. In June of 1547, we have a threatening letter that is put on Calvin's pulpit, and a man named Jacques Gruet is put to death. He's sentenced to death, not by John Calvin. He's sentenced to death by the city council for conspiring against their pastor. But again, all of this is evidence of a brewing discontent among some of the people in Geneva against Calvin. Over the next few years, the Libertines grow in strength. They eventually come to control the city council, and it gets so bad that Calvin's ready to quit. And in 1553, Calvin asks the city council for permission to resign, and the city council refuses to allow him to resign because they enjoy making his life miserable. So it's kind of interesting in a time period where the pastor is really under the control of the city council. They don't even give him the option of quitting when he asks to quit. Yep, Daniel.
Was there a certain time that they put him under their control?
Well, just because the entire canton of Geneva is under it's a city-state under the control of the Geneva City Council. In the same way that a king would have jurisdiction in a monarchical state, the city council is the ruling authority in Geneva. Calvin really doesn't have a choice except to do what they say. I mean, he could have fled, I suppose, but outside of becoming an exile and kind of an outlaw, he was forced to stay.
Any idea why Strasbourg just didn't force him to come back after 6 months?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what all transpired in the relationship that he had with Strasbourg. I know that he maintained a good relationship with Martin Bucer, but I think by this point he had been in Geneva so long that any sort of claim that Strasbourg would have still had on him would have expired by this point. He is fully under the control of Geneva at this time period, and they refuse to accept his resignation. And so he's forced to stay. But I think it's helpful for us, again, to recognize, things in Calvin's church got so bad that he asked to quit, and they told him he couldn't. All right. Osterhaven says this: the opposition soon made plans to destroy or discredit the reformer. So they wanted him to stay, but not because they liked him. They wanted him to stay because they wanted to make his life even worse. One of these resulted in a direct confrontation between Calvin and the city council, the Council of 200. The issue was the excommunication of a man named Philibert Bertlier, the council's secretary by the consistory of the Church of Geneva in 1551, and his absolution by the state council in 1553. So there's the church council and the city council. The church council says this man needs to be excommunicated. The city council says no, he will not be excommunicated. So now we have a rift between the city council, who has all of the real political power, and the church council, which is just in charge of the stuff that happens at church. The following Sunday was communion. So once again, the issue is going to climax around the Lord's Supper. Calvin preached in St. Peter's, and at the close of the sermon declared that he would never profane the sacrament by giving it to an excommunicated person. Over his head on the pulpit, his emblem was set, a heart aflame in an outstretched hand offered to God. So Osterhaven goes on. His famous motto was embossed on the dark red velvet pulpit cover, Soli Deo Gloria. Raising his voice and lifting up his hands, he exclaimed in the words of Chrysostom, I will lay down my life before these hands give the sacred things of God to those who have been branded as his despisers. A crowd of libertines surged forward to the table where the elements were. Calvin, descending from the pulpit, from the vestibule, stood before the table. With drawn sword, a libertine cried, Administer communion to us, or you will die. His head thrown back and his arms extended over the sacred elements, Calvin responded that although they might cut off his arms, shed his blood, and take his life, they would never force him to give holy things to the profane and dishonor the table of God. So Calvin not only tried to quit, he almost dies in church, protecting the communion table. Osterhaven concludes the story. The crowd was stunned, and a long silence followed the dramatic moment. Perrin, one of the city syndics opposed to Calvin, quietly ordered Bertlier not to approach the table. So, communion was saved. After the crowd withdrew, Beza reports, communion was celebrated in profound silence and under a solemn awe as if the deity himself had been visibly present among them. So this is the kind of stuff that's going on in Geneva at this time period, and it's the city council versus Calvin. And that's going to become an important point when we get to the death of Michael Servetus, because people blame Calvin for that, but it was really the city council who put Servetus to death, and Calvin was not in control of the city council by any means. At that point, the city council wanted to do everything it could to discredit Calvin and to make his life miserable, because the Libertines were in control of the city council. Another interesting connection point here with something we'll talk about later is this commitment to the closed table, or the fencing of the table of communion. What is sometimes called fencing the Lord's table. What it means is we only allow believers to participate in the Lord's table. That's going to become an issue again in colonial America around the time of Jonathan Edwards. And Edwards is actually going to take a stand for fencing the table, and it's what becomes the catalyst for him being fired from his church in Northampton after 20 years of ministry there. So this whole issue of will we allow non-believers to participate in the Lord's table is a big deal in some of these episodes in church history. Yep, Mike.
Just a quick question, just so I'm tracking properly. There's the two councils, there's the church council and the city council. Which was the one that he asked to resign? Obviously the church council, was that?
No, I'm sorry. The church council is under Calvin's authority, and it only controls matters pertaining to the church itself.
Okay, so the council of 200 is actually the city
Is
council.
the city council, and Calvin asked the city council if he could resign because they're the ones who are his employers. They're the ones who have the political authority over him.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so here's an artist rendering of that dramatic scene, and you can see the Libertines have rushed the table, and they're ready to draw their swords and kill their pastor because he won't let a church-disciplined member participate in the Lord's Supper without due process and repentance, which Bertlier had not shown. That brings us then to the Michael Servetus Affair, and this will probably take us to the end of our class period today. The turning point in the whole issue with the Libertines and with Calvin and with the conflict that he was experiencing actually came as a result of the whole issue related to Michael Servetus, and we'll explain that a little bit more as we go. Servetus was a well-known heretic for particularly his false views of the Trinity. He was opposed by both Catholics and Protestants, and the reality is that anywhere that Servetus had gone in Europe, he would have been put to death if he had been arrested. And in fact, he was arrested, I believe it was in France, and he was going to be put on trial and killed, but he escaped and ended up coming to Geneva. Servetus had exchanged a number of letters with Calvin, though Calvin eventually refused to answer Servetus's letters and regarded him as a heretic. And then, as I mentioned, he was arrested in France but later escaped. While en route to Italy, Servetus stops in Geneva, probably to just taunt Calvin some more, because in many of his letters he had really gone after Calvin. When he was recognized, he was arrested. He was tried by the Geneva court. This was all under the auspice of the Geneva City Council. It had nothing to do with the church council per se. He was found guilty and he was burned at the stake. His only involvement in the trial was that he had been brought in as a witness with regard to what constituted blasphemy. And Servetus very much was a blasphemer. And so Calvin had said, yeah, he is guilty of blasphemy, but Calvin had sought mercy for Servetus, and the city council drug out the trial as a way to embarrass Calvin because, again, they didn't like him. They were trying to make life miserable for him. A number of Libertines were involved in the trial. They were forced to side with Calvin because the popular opinion throughout the rest of Switzerland and Europe favored the fact that Servetus was guilty. So there's a picture of Servetus. And just to really explain all of this, we're going to read a little bit from Godfrey. He says this: in August of 1553, an even more difficult time for Calvin began when Michael Servetus arrived in Geneva. He was a Spanish physician who was an old theological enemy of Calvin. As early as the 1530s, Servetus had written a book rejecting the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. He was part of a small movement in the 16th century that concluded that the Trinity was a false doctrine imposed on Christians by the Roman Catholic Church. Servetus argued that Jesus was not divine and was not the eternal Son of God. Already in the 1530s, Calvin tried to arrange a meeting with Servetus so that he could win him from his heresy. Calvin went to the meeting that had been arranged, but Servetus did not show up. Still, Servetus continued to write against the Trinity, which was a very dangerous thing to do. Almost anywhere in Europe, if he had been denounced to the authorities, he would have been arrested and executed. But he wrote anonymously and often moved from place to place. In the mid-1540s, Calvin again corresponded with Servetus to try to persuade him of the error of his ways. When that effort failed, Calvin warned him that the doctrine he was espousing was lethal to his own soul and dangerous to the Christian community and would lead to his execution if arrested. Early in 1553, Servetus published yet another work attacking the Trinity entitled Restitution of the Christian Religion. The title was a clear and deliberate attack on Calvin and his institutes of the Christian religion. So, I mean, this guy is just needling Calvin all along the way. After this work appeared, Servetus was arrested by Roman authorities in southern France. He managed to escape, but was condemned in absentia for his heresy and would have been executed had he been captured in France. As Servetus knew, for over 1,000 years, Christian governments had judged anti-Trinitarianism to be a capital offense because it's blasphemy to deny the deity of the second member of the Trinity. Servetus arrived in Geneva in August of 1553, probably intending to cause trouble for Calvin. He was recognized, denounced, and arrested as a notorious heretic. Calvin insisted that he be placed on trial for his heresy. The city council saw the trial of Servetus as a possible opportunity to embarrass Calvin. Yet they knew they could not side with Servetus, so they decided to drag out the trial as a way to harass Calvin. They delayed the trial by writing various governments in Switzerland and elsewhere in Europe seeking advice on how Servetus ought to be treated. Almost all the letters that came back had the same advice. He must be condemned for his terrible heresy and executed. Calvin and the other ministers continued to appeal to Servetus to repent right up to the time of his execution, but Servetus adamantly maintained his heresy. In fact, Calvin would go and meet with him in the jail cell and try and convince him to repent and embrace the deity of Christ. Through the centuries since this execution, Calvin has been frequently portrayed as severe, judgmental, intolerant, and violent. He has been represented as a great persecutor. In fact, Calvin's attitude towards punishing heretics was quite typical in the 16th century. However barbaric such views may seem today, the vast majority of Europeans would have agreed with Calvin in his day. In fact, there were fewer executions for heresy in Geneva than in many parts of Europe. I would add to that Calvin sought a much lighter sentence against Servetus than the city council, at least a much milder form of execution. The city council insisted on burning Servetus at the stake. Calvin did not want that to happen. He wanted Servetus, if executed, to be executed in a more humane way. Moreover, it was not Calvin who found Servetus guilty. It was a city tribunal, and it was not Calvin who in any way authorized Servetus' execution. It was the Geneva City Council who authorized that. So when we take all of those factors into consideration, I think Calvin is largely exonerated when it comes to the treatment of Michael Servetus in particular. Now, I'll let you certainly form your own conclusions about that, but it is interesting, and here's that cartoon that I showed you even last week, but here's where it fits in the lecture. It is interesting how often the execution of Michael Servetus is used by those who don't like Calvinism as an ad hominem character attack on Calvin, which they think somehow undermines the entire theological system. It's an unfair assassination on Calvin's character, and it represents an ignorance of the actual historical facts more than it does a good argument against Calvin. So, in Zwingli's case, I think Zwingli is more culpable because Zwingli actually is in line with the City Council of Zurich in the execution and the executionary mode that he endorses against the Anabaptists. In Calvin's case, he and the city council are actually at odds with each other when all of this is going down.